Okay, wanted to welcome everybody again to the uh, Spring Cyberseminars for Kawazi. I'm Stephen Brantley, and the title of the seminar, or the series, is Evapotranspiration: Frontiers in Measurement, Modeling, and Management from the Leap to the Landscape. Just a quick reminder that next week will be our final presentation in the series, and that's going to be by Paul Story of Montana State University, and he's going to be talking about evaporation measurements from eddy covariance, towers, network level insights, energy balance, and emerging imperatives. It should be a very enjoyable presentation. Paul's a pretty neat guy, and I hope you can join in next week. This week, we're going to hear from Adrian Harpold. Adrian did his PhD work at Cornell University and then worked at University of Arizona and University of Colorado before just starting recently as an assistant professor at University of Nevada-Reno. And he's going to be talking about water vapor fluxes from snow-covered landscapes and the importance of biotic and abiotic-mediated processes. So Adrian, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen, for the opportunity. It's my first cyber seminar, so I'll try to hold the phone and click through the slides like I know what I'm doing. So I'll just jump in here. I'm kind of going with a wider scope today to talk about some of the work I've been involved in and some of the sort of larger questions I think in the field, which I've kind of framed around these paradoxes, or probably better term trade-offs, in water vapor fluxes in snow-dominated or snowy systems, which we'll go through sort of individually and then try to put some meat on the bone at the end. So how can snowmelt be both an efficient irrigator of vegetation and efficiently generate stream flow? And will warming temperatures generate more or less vapor loss? What are the trade-offs between canopy interception and subcanopy or snowpack sublimation? And what are the trade-offs between abiotic and biotic vapor losses on larger scale water budgets? And then try to frame some of this around some natural experiments using forest disturbance to try to answer some of these questions. So I think these questions are quite important for water management and hydrology in general. So I have my acknowledgement slide up front. This work is really a team of researchers and several different projects that I'm presenting. So the first few gentlemen I worked with at the University of Arizona, and the last group of people are colleagues from the University of Colorado. So really a lot of this work is a team effort that I'd like to acknowledge up front. So this is a slide I've been using to start a lot of my presentations lately, just to kind of frame why work in snowy systems. This is the PRISM gridded mean precipitation over a 30-year period. And if you look at the western U.S., you can see that we have high precipitation areas that are isolated, and they're generally driven by topography and orographic lift. So the wet areas that we depend on are pretty topographically isolated, particularly in the west. And these same areas, due to atmospheric processes, are also cooler, right? They're higher elevation. So if we look at the same PRISM now we're looking at the minimum temperature over a 30-year period. These are cooler areas. This is in Fahrenheit. A lot of these areas are below 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees C. So the wet areas we depend on for water resources are also cool and probably receive at least a bulk of their precipitation as snow as a result. And then perhaps more interestingly, and certainly from the perspective of a lot of the talk today, is these areas are also co-located with forest and above ground biomass. So this is an above ground biomass map of the same area. And so these are our forests, our woodlands, our shrublands, So places where we see there's this co-variation in water, energy, and carbon that make these areas really important to study. And just to kind of wrap your head around what a water budget in one of these systems might look like, this is just one example from my newly adopted home here in the Eastern Sierra of a site in the South Lake Tahoe region. If we take a really simple sort of view of what a water budget looks like, we might think that precipitation, P, is the sum of evapotranspiration or vapor losses plus Q, which is stream flow in this case, or runoff from the system. And so on a 30-year average, we're seeing nearly a 1-to-1, or about 50% of the water budget going to evapotranspiration, about 50% to discharge. But these systems are highly dynamic, and so you can see in a wet year, you have about 75% of the water budget going to Q or discharge, and in a dry year, you have about 75% of the water budget going to evapotranspiration. So the variation driven by climate of these systems is quite large, and you can imagine quite important for predicting water resources. But really, that's an overly simplistic view of the water budget, especially when we want to talk about evapotranspiration, which is really the focus of the talk today. So we have stream flow and storage, but if we start thinking about ET, we could potentially partition that ET farther down into transpiration or the biotic-mediated losses, as well as the more abiotic-mediated losses of soil evaporation, snow sublimation, and interception by forest canopy or vegetation canopy. So the case I'm making today is that if we want to understand environmental change in these systems, we really need to be able to understand how water gets partitioned into these different stores, how sensitive they are to climate, and how sensitive they are to physical changes in the system. And that's really important because there's several different vectors of environmental change in these systems. One that I'll focus on quite a bit later in the talk is beetle outbreaks. So this is some work by Adrian showing beetle outbreaks across the western U.S. Obviously quite severe and spatially widespread. So we'll look at some of the effects of that in Colorado later in the talk. And then fire regimes are also changing. And so if you have a fire come through your site, especially a high severity fire, that can change the biophysical controls on the system with potential impacts for ET and vapor losses. But unique probably to these snow-dominated systems are changes in the snowpack regime. So we're seeing changes in snow accumulation. On the left here, I'm showing changes from snow to rain, where the red symbols are increasing rain or decreasing snow. And on the right, I'm showing changes in April 1st snowpacks, which is a key water resource time period for estimating water resources. And the take-home here is that our snowpacks are changing. We're seeing less snow, more rain, and potentially as a consequence of that, as well as changing precipitation patterns, more mid-season melt, we're seeing changes in the net amount of snow remaining in the system when we begin melt. We're also seeing changes in ablation, or loss of mass of the snowpack. And so if we look over the last 30 years, we can see changes in our snowmelt, our length of snowmelt, which is called SM50 here. So shorter snowmelt lengths over the course of that 30 years, and changes in sublimation that we're inferring here as a ratio of snow water equivalent, or SWE, to winter precipitation. So we're seeing these systems kind of change before our eyes, both in terms of the amount of snow that they accumulate, but also where that snow is going. And so we're really interested in what are the impacts of this on water partitioning. And in this example, or in this talk, I'll be very much focused on evapotranspiration. So some work that I've recently been involved with has really been trying to tease apart this paradigm of how can snowmelt be both an efficient irrigator of vegetation and efficient at generating stream flow. And how a lot of good work is motivated is you read a paper that really, stimulates you and makes you kind of scratch your head. And so this is a recent paper from Nature Climate Change showing the relationship between water partitioning across snowy and rainy regions. And let me walk you through this a little bit. It's kind of a complex graph here that I'll use a few times. So we call this black line here a Butico relationship, which is an empirical relationship that relates the evaporative index, or your evapotranspiration over precipitation, so your evaporation efficiency, to your dryness index, which is your potential evapotranspiration over precipitation. So it's how efficiently you evaporate water from the system as a function of climate. And what this is showing in red are snow-dominated systems that really span the entire range of 0 to 1 in terms of their evaporation efficiency. So highly variable in terms of climate and water partitioning. But if we look, they all tend to fall below the Butico line, that light black thin line. And so they overgenerate stream flow with respect to the Butico relationship. And that's what that right-hand panel is showing. It's showing as you increase snowfall fraction, your anomaly becomes more positive. So controlling for climate, these snowy systems are more efficient at generating stream flow. And understanding that has really captured me and some of the other people that I've got thinking about this. And one of the ways that we're trying to explain this is using soil moisture response. So some data that we pulled together from a large number of sites across the western U.S. is showing that snowmelt timing is strongly related to peak soil moisture. So peak soil moisture is controlled by snowmelt regimes. So consequently, if we think about the sort of water budget of the soil profile, these are the periods most likely to exceed storage, most likely to exceed field capacity and have gravity-driven storage. And so this is a reason we might think these snowmelt-dominated systems are efficient at generating stream flow. We've also used a variable infiltration capacity model, or the VIC model. So this is some work by Theo Barnhart that we're putting together that's showing basically reproducing the Berghuis data on the left-hand panel. So this is the runoff anomaly from the Butico relationship as a function of snowfall fraction. So we see that positive relationship, more snow, more efficient runoff generation. But reframing that in terms of snowmelt rate. So if we think about, again, the soil profile water budget, we can hypothesize that systems that are more quickly pumping water into that profile may exceed the storage capacity and the field capacity of the system. And so we see an even stronger relationship between snowmelt rate and that runoff anomaly than we do between snowfall fraction itself. So we're beginning to understand some of the processes that might lead to efficient stream flow generation. But the sort of converse of that is that we also see strong evidence that snowmelt is also very good at becoming transpiration and irrigating the vegetation in these systems. So I apologize for this sort of floating text in the upper left of the panel. That's some kind of conversion issue. But what you're looking at here is the snow depth, those multiple colored lines over the course of a season. And so you can see snow accumulate for several months and then melt out. And the darker blue line is the net ecosystem exchange of this system measured with eddy covariance at a site in Colorado. And what I'll draw your attention to is what these two dotted black lines. So when the system begins to see melt at the peak snow depth, that's exactly coincident with when the trees begin to turn on and net ecosystem exchange goes up. And then right when snow melt is ending, so when snow is disappearing out of the system, this is the annual maximum net ecosystem exchange. So we see strong evidence here that snow melt is both controlling the timing of NEE as well as some of its magnitude. And some nice work by Jahu at the same site in Colorado shows this over multiple years. So you're looking at snow water equivalent versus growing season length in the bottom of that two-panel graph. And you can see as snow water equivalent goes down, your growing season length actually becomes longer because snow melts earlier, the trees are allowed to turn on earlier, and your growing season is longer. But that actually leads to reductions in net ecosystem productivity. So longer growing season lengths lead to lower net ecosystem productivity. And this was kind of a counterintuitive result, except when you consider that these are water-limited systems. Ja also did some interesting isotopic partitioning of snow versus rain, which is the bottom right panel, to show that the gross primary productivity of the system was mostly driven by snow, not only immediately after snow melt, but throughout the summer season when you were getting rain events all the way into late fall. So the system was wetted up by snow melt, and that turned the trees on, but it also controlled their sort of long-term response over the course of the growing season. So one of the big questions I think that probably a lot of us consider is what warming temperatures will do to these systems, and how hydrologic partitioning might be affected by that. And that's certainly a big question for these snow-dominated systems. And one of the reasons it's such an interesting challenge is illustrated by this figure from Steve Running and colleague, showing limitations on transpiration of vegetation. And if you look at the western U.S., you can see that we kind of lie somewhere in that purple region. So we're somewhere between temperature and water limited. And so that means that in some, there's not a lot of spatial resolution to this figure, but it means that we probably for some part of the year are temperature limited, and for some part of the year water limited. So if we start raising temperatures in these systems, we can see some pretty interesting effects. This is a nice paper from Mike Goulden and Roger Bales published last year, showing the response of a large basin in western Sierra Nevadas, where the upper right panel I'm showing is precipitation and precipitation minus evapotranspiration, or the water subsidy, as a function of elevation. And what you can see is that precipitation goes up, and evapotranspiration actually tends to go down at very high elevations. And so your water subsidy, your P minus ET, is mainly driven by these high elevation areas. So if you start to warm these areas, and you start to reduce some of those temperature limitations on evapotranspiration, their expectation with their simple model was that you start to increase ET. So that's what this bottom left-hand panel is showing, is that under these different warming scenarios, ET is strongly at these high elevations, and the conclusion that they came to was that if forests are able to move up and use water in these areas because they're no longer temperature limited, that's going to have major implications on basin scale water fluxes, where stream flow, they predicted, would go down. And I think that that's an interesting paradigm, and certainly strongly supported by their data set. One thing that we've been considering too is looking at a site in the alpine and subalpine regions of Colorado is changes in the alpine water and the snowmelt regimes of the alpine area could have strongly impacting effects on larger scale water budgets. So this figure I'm just noticing has the Y label cut off, but the function of stream flow being derived from these two ecosystems. And so alpine area is generating about 60% of the watershed scale stream flow, even though it's only 35% of the catchment area. So if if runoff processes were to change and water subsidies were to change as a result of changing snowmelt from, say, warming temperatures, as I showed earlier, possibly faster snowmelt, that might have sort of overwhelming effects on some of the changes in water and temperature limitations on transpiration. So this trade-off between reduced temperature limitations and higher ET and potentially faster snowmelt and or earlier snowmelt from warming temperatures remains, I would say, an active area of research. Another area that we've spent time thinking about quite a bit is trade-offs between canopy interception and snowpack sublimation. So those of you who have walked around in a snowy forest will recognize a picture like this. You get a snowstorm, snow is left in the forest canopy, and that snow sublimates or in some cases evaporates, and that is a major control on how snow is distributed in a healthy forest. But the forest also acts to shelter the snowpack beneath it, so it shades the snowpack, reduces shortwave radiation, reduces wind speeds and turbulent kinetic energy and turbulent heat fluxes. And so there's these kind of trade-off in effects caused by healthy, thick forest canopy. And this simple figure here from just one site in a healthy forest is sort of illustrating that. As you go to a denser canopy cover, you see less snow. So I'm showing that as your snow water equivalent to precipitation ratio, or SWE to P. And so of all the winter precipitation that fell, only about 45% remains in a dense canopy. So presumably, canopy sublimation via interception is a major control on these dense forests. Whereas you move to a open or no forest canopy cover, and you're seeing SWE to P ratios of more like 0.75. So about 25% of all the precipitation that fell is no longer there. But that suggests that because interception is a minor control in these open areas, that we are seeing effects of snowpack sublimation. So while canopy interception seems to dominate a healthy forest in terms of net water inputs, we can see the effects of snowpack sublimation even in a healthy forest. And when we start to look at real landscapes, that simple sort of classification of forest canopy cover starts to break down. So this figure that I'm showing here is a LiDAR-derived snow depth map over a 1 square kilometer area where the shallow snow depth is warmer colors bleeding into cooler colors at the higher snow depths, and the white areas are occluded areas of vegetation canopy. And so you can see at the 1 kilometer scale very strong variability across this site that's relatively flat, driven principally by vegetation canopy cover. And then if we go into the zoom in here at the 100-meter scale, we see tremendous variability in open areas and near canopy that would be difficult to explain with just a simple canopy cover metric for interception. And so to try to get a better handle on some of those fine-scale processes and the trade-offs between interception and snowpack sublimation, Patrick Broxton built a model using LiDAR-derived canopy information and topography information to close a water and energy budget at a 1 meter scale. And we trained this model and validated this model to eddy covariance sites at each location, as well as distributed snow depth from LiDAR that I showed in the previous figure. And we ran this model at 2 sites where we had sufficient forcing data. That was our Boulder Creek watershed in Colorado and the Jemez River Basin in New Mexico. And I'm just showing one illustration here of snowpack vapor loss or snowpack sublimation to make the case that we can now, with a model product, begin to tease apart these fluxes. So we can classify what is interception, what is snowpack sublimation. And what we see is pretty interesting when we compare the 2 sites. We see differences in the fraction of winter precipitation that is being lost to total vapor loss. And we can start to understand that that's principally driven by differences in snowpack sublimation rather than interception across these sites. So this can be a powerful tool, although difficult to verify like many of these models are, but powerful tool to start to tease apart these trade-offs. But what's actually more powerful about a fine-scale model like this is that it shows you the importance of these finer resolutions. So when we look at the fraction of vaporization, or V, coming from sublimation, when we run the model at different scales, so we're not changing the physics of the model, we're not changing the forcing, we're simply basically smoothing the vegetation by coarsening the model to what would be considered high resolution for many hydrology models at 30 or 100 meters, we're seeing the partitioning of vapor losses change. So not only does sublimation become a bigger fraction of the total vapor losses, the magnitude of sublimation actually increases. And we see this at both sides. So it suggests that these trade-offs, to capture these trade-offs in interception and sublimation, really consider processes that are essentially the tree or stand scale. Okay, and a final, what I'll call trade-off, is between abiotic and biotic vapor losses. And I'll go back to the site we have, Niwot Ridge in Colorado, and to make the point that these sites generate runoff at different efficiencies. So going back to our Butico curve, we can see that the blue dots, or the alpine tundra, is falling below our Butico line, generating stream flow much more efficiently than the green dots, which are on the Butico line. And so small changes in our abiotic dominated system, the alpine tundra, could have large impacts for water budgets. But it becomes difficult to look at these sorts of effects, especially in an observational type of framework, because we're comparing different ecosystems with different climates. And so where I'll take you for the rest of the talk is really trying to ask the question, well, what if we had the opportunity to chop down all the trees in the subalpine tundra, and we could look at how the abiotic processes might change following disturbance to a biotically mediated process or system. And although it's not the 1950s anymore, and we can't just go down chop down trees for the sake of science, like maybe we once were a couple generations ago, we have, for better or worse, these landscape scale disturbances in these forested systems that are really allowing us a natural experiment to test some of these hypotheses. And this site right here is southern Wyoming, from a site that we'll look at quite a bit here. So The Southern Rocky Mountains are really a great example of where you might want to ask these questions because they are snow-dominated, as the left-hand panel shows. And these snow-dominated areas are generally forests, as the center panel shows. And these forests have been heavily impacted by disturbance vectors, as the right-hand panel shows. So the right-hand panel, the colors are insect disturbance, and the black crosses are fires over a relatively short period of time. So this is only really going back to, say, 2007. So there's a lot of, we'll say, opportunity to look at these effects, but there's also a lot of societally relevant questions for places like the Front Range of Colorado, northern New Mexico, in terms of future water resources impacts. So we came into this looking mostly at mountain pine beetle. And mountain pine beetle is a beetle that carries a fungus, and that fungus essentially kills the tree and stops transpiration. So we built a simple conceptual figure to try to understand what are the impacts of these forest disturbances. Well, you can see after weeks after disturbance, transpiration turns off. So the trees are essentially dead. And then within months, the trees begin to lose their needles and interception decreases. So more precipitation is making it through the canopy. So our first scale hypothesis is that more snow is accumulating and the trees are using less, so we expect larger snowpacks and increased stream flow. But sort of a secondary energy anomaly would also expect, as the canopy opened, that we would let more shortwave radiation under the canopy to the ground or the snow surface, and we would also potentially increase wind speed. So this was our sort of working hypotheses, and we went out. So we really justify this type of work by looking at some of the state-of-the-art land surface models and how they respond to some of these disturbances. So this slide from work by Dave Gotchis shows sort of the problems that we have in being able to predict the response of these systems. So if we look at, if we focus on these purple bars, we're going from essentially a healthy forest with a leaf area index of 4 to an impacted forest with a leaf area index of 1. And the NOAA model, actually, it shows a decrease in total ET. That purple bar goes down, whereas the CLM4 model shows an increase in total ET. And so you can look at soil evaporation and canopy evaporation, and the partitioning of those also changes, but we have trouble even predicting the sign of change using our models. So there's really an opportunity to try to better understand the processes driving this to improve our models and test our models. And so that's what we did through a course of a few different studies. What is pretty indisputable is when you go out to these disturbed sites that have lost a great deal of canopy through either fire or pine beetle, that more snow accumulates on the land surface, right? You open the canopy, less surface area to intercept snow, and you see more snow accumulate. So this is one new snow event where we see twice as much snow accumulating in a post-fire stand as in a healthy stand. So this would lead to the hypothesis that we should see more snow at the end of the season and larger snow melts. But two studies that we did suggest otherwise, somewhat surprisingly. So on the right-hand panel is a study that we did in northern New Mexico comparing a healthy and a post-fire site. And what I'm showing is the amount of water that came in as precipitation and that remained as maximum snow water equivalent with the ratio of the two as the SWE to P. And you can see that the ratio of SWE to P remained around 6 cent in the post-fire stand, despite observations that there was reduced interception. And we can look at a very similar figure from a paper by Joel Biederman from southern Wyoming with a control site in northern Colorado. And we again see that the ratio of SWE to P really remains unchanged, or in fact decreases following disturbance. So why is that? Well, we had a handful of complementary measurements to try to answer that question. This panel is showing water vapor fluxes measured from an eddy covariance tower as a fraction of precipitation, and at our healthy and our pine beetle affected sites. And what you see is that the vapor fluxes are essentially the same or near similar across 3 different years during the winter. So we're seeing about the same amount of vapor going into the atmosphere. And we also I can see that it deleted. There was another sort of transformation error, but that orange dotted box is highlighting changes in shortwave radiation, but the label was deleted. So changes in shortwave radiation, where we're observing higher ratios of shortwave radiation under the canopy in our disturbed sites. So kind of what we expected, that wind speed is slightly going up as well as shortwave radiation, and as a result, we're seeing relatively similar vapor fluxes in our healthy and disturbed site. So the take-home point here in terms of trade-offs between interception and snowpack sublimation is that we switch from a regime that's dominated by interception in healthy forests to a regime dominated by snowpack sublimation in disturbed forests. And as a consequence, in these particular southern Rockies types of environments, we're seeing near compensating effects. So we see essentially the same amount of winter vapor fluxes in a healthy and a post-disturbance site. And whether these are transferable to other sites, I think remains an open question. We certainly see variability in this response across the literature. Well, that's an interesting result. That says something about sort of the abiotic wintertime vapor losses, but what about this issue with transpiration turning off, and what does it mean for sort of larger scale water budgets? So I'm showing here again a similar figure, eddy covariance measured vapor fluxes, but now during the summer as a fraction of the total annual precipitation. And what we're seeing, again, is that the bars look pretty similar to each other. So the healthy and the pine beetle affected forests across 3 years have similar vapor losses above canopy. And so we don't really see that effect that we might have, that we hypothesized, that driving down transpiration, turning off essentially transpiration. This pine beetle affected site had near 80% mortality, was going to have a dramatic effect on summer vapor losses. We see similar summer vapor losses measured above canopy. And I won't spend too much time on this figure, but what it's showing is the water isotopes, so O18 and deuterium for our unimpacted site and our pine beetle affected site. And we're seeing evidence of kinetic fractionation and enrichment only at our mountain pine beetle site. So the water isotope values are plotting below the local meteoric water line, the black line, only at our mountain pine beetle affected sites for both soil water and stream flow, suggesting, strongly suggesting evaporation processes that's indicative of kinetic fractionation, and potentially only at our pine beetle observed sites. So there is some evidence here of soil evaporation. So what does this mean for larger scale water budgets? Well, we took a stab at this using a couple different methods. The Q is measured stream flow, and the Q star is a measure of stream flow as precipitation minus measured evapotranspiration. And what I'm showing here is runoff efficiency, or Q over P, how efficient the system was at generating runoff as a fraction of precipitation. And again, the bars can be quite similar, say in 2010, and then we actually see quite a bit less runoff coming out of our pine beetle disturbed site. So our hypothesis that Opening the canopy, reducing interception, as well as turning off transpiration was going to drive up stream flow doesn't appear to be true at this particular site. Well, why is that? Well, I showed, hopefully convincingly, that we're seeing some trade-offs between interception and snowpack sublimation that aren't really increasing water inputs to the system. And we also see some evidence through water isotopes of soil evaporation increasing in the post-disturbed system. But really, the riddle remains somewhat unsolved. We think that regrowth of under canopy vegetation, possibly compensating effects by living remaining vegetation in forests, could be a driver of this. But we don't know, and I think more process level work is really needed across a range of sites to give a concrete answer for this. But we were interested in asking the question, does our sort of first order watershed represent responses across this region? So some work that Joel Biederman has been leading and has just been submitted tried to do this across a range of sites along the Continental Divide in Colorado. So we took 8 watersheds that have been heavily impacted by pine beetle, and so that's what this complicated figure is showing, is our 8 watersheds and our 1 control, and mortality increasing. And the take home here is mortality increased all around 2005 and led to fairly high forest mortality at these sites overall. So Joel took 3 different relatively simple approaches to trying to understand partitioning in these systems, and I won't go into detail about each one. But the take home here is that looking across these systems, the only real significant changes we saw following disturbance was to a decrease in runoff. So less stream flow following disturbance. And in most cases, we really saw no significant change. So we think that the process-based understanding we've built using detailed observations from our site in Wyoming helps to explain this, and it really suggests that the processes we observed are transferable and have larger scale impacts on water partitioning from these systems. So I will wrap up with a couple of take-home points. Snowmelt is both, because it's effectively infiltrates and percolates through the soil profile, it can be both effective for providing storage, soil water storage for transpiration, as well as generating water subsidies for runoff. And trade-offs between interception and snowpack sublimation are strongly mediated by climate and vegetation structure, can be compensating to each other under certain conditions, but I think more work is necessary to understand how climate and vegetation guide or control that trade-off. And finally, in the sites that we looked at in the southern Rocky Mountains, we believe that abiotic-mediated vapor losses are compensating for changes in biotic-mediated vapor losses following disturbance. So we think that evaporation might be higher as transpiration goes down, although compensating biotic vapor losses by remaining vegetation or new vegetation could also be a culprit that really deserves some further investigations. So I hope that with some food for thought about measuring ET in these systems and where we need to take research in the coming years.
Okay, thanks, Adrian, and we have plenty of time for questions. If you want, just type your question into the box, and I'll try to moderate the questions as they come in. What I'll do is, as questions are typed, I'll just go ahead and repeat them audibly for people that just want to listen. and let Adrian address each one individually. So I see we have at least one person typing now. But absolutely excellent talk, Adrian. A lot of the same questions that I've dealt with looking at issues with hemlock woolly adelgid back here in the east. And I wish you had, published some of these research a couple of years ago. But it would have been good.
Well, feel free to cite them now.
Yeah, good fodder. Yeah, I certainly will. And I'll let my former colleagues know that this is ongoing.
No, it is similar to rain-dominated systems, except in the sense that maybe we hold that, holding the snow above the ground potentially exposes it to more atmospheric forcing.
Okay, so we have a first question here. Can there be compensating effects due to increased temperature, evapotranspiration, and precipitation? If temperature increases and ET increases, can precipitation also increase locally? So we're looking at, I guess, at a feedback mechanism of temperature and ET leading to more precipitation, or maybe I've reworded that incorrectly, but I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see in a lot of sort of science these days is we're hesitant to make predictions about precipitation because, our GCMs and RCMs don't do a particularly good job predicting future changes in precipitation. So that's a huge compounding effect here. There is some good physical basis to think that precipitation might increase at higher elevations as the atmosphere starts to be able to hold more water. But certainly, precipitation amounts are, I would say, the first order control, and I think that's on ET and just water partitioning in general, and I think that's what that first sort of slide with the pie charts was showing, that in a wet year, your partitioning is extremely different than in a dry year. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that is a huge open question, or these sort of feedbacks and interactions between higher water demand, higher water inputs.
And you got a thank you for that. We also have a request. Will you add your references to the archive presentation?
Sure, I'll put another slide on the end.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea too. Several of those seem very relevant. We have another couple of folks typing. I was going to ask a quick question about the interception. I do quite a bit of interception modeling in rain-dominated systems. For snow interception, do we see a cycle of interception and then immediate evaporation, or once snow has fallen for the year, does snow pretty much stay on the canopy throughout the entire winter?
Well, it really depends on the system. But I would say generally you see this more storm-mediated storage. And there's some good work coming out about this. Certainly increased energy inputs, increased wind is all going to, be more of a strong signal towards the event type of interception. But I would say that's more of the rule than the exception.
Okay. And we have another comment from Steve Burgess about getting the precipitation right, and that is the single most important issue in the water budget.
I completely agree. Yeah. And also I think the case to be made is that getting precipitation right in snow-dominated systems is even harder because undercatch becomes even more of an issue.
Right, and I know it having worked in a system where we got about 5% of our precip or less from snow, we always still put quite a bit of effort into getting as accurate a measure of that snowfall as possible. We don't have to worry about that here in South Georgia, thankfully, but yeah. So it looks like we had a couple more folks typing.
Well, there is quite a bit of work in terms of measuring precipitation. I think doing it at high elevations remains an open question, and then being able to have low-cost, small footprint type of samplers also remains quite difficult because you really need to reduce undercatch, and that really means buffering wind, and it's hard to do that in complex topography.
Right, and there's just a lot of inherent variation in general. Even if you had an entire network, hundreds of sensors, correctly installed and buffered, you would still get a tremendous amount of variation. But you got to thank you for excellent, balanced, integrative presentation, and I would agree with that as well. And two more questions. Well, one more question. Have you looked at correlation with surface roughness length? And have you documented the type of pioneering vegetation following disturbance? Rapidly establishing vegetation might be very water consuming. And I would tend to agree with that, but what kind of vegetation do you see after pine beetle or fire in these systems?
Well, that's again can be somewhat of a site-specific question, but what we've seen is that the aspen type of vegetation comes back most quickly, especially if they're more isolated type of fire events, because that vegetate. My understanding is they've already colonized the site, and so a lot of times they're able to basically just rapidly take advantage of that. We also saw over the course of a few years more of the sort of forbs and grasses start to certainly be more important. And there's no question that must have some level of impact on larger scale water budgets. I think one of the interesting questions, though, is can those type of vegetation access deeper water, or are they restricted to accessing more of the shallow soil water pools? Because that would certainly be a restriction on how much they could compensate in some cases.
And the other part of that question was about the surface roughness length.
Yeah, turbulence is, man, that's hard to measure. I think that there's clearly changes in surface roughness length, turbulence, something that we've kind of tried to get at through wind speeds, turbulent kinetic energy, but clearly it does. And, the spatial variability of that is extreme. Not something that we've done, I would say, directly is measuring surface roughness length, but certainly a way to potentially try to capture some of these changing biophysical effects.
Okay, and then our next question is really more for me and Emily, but is the presentation archived and how to access it? Emily, can you put a link to the archive presentations up? Is that
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our cyber seminars are recorded and then posted on the Quasi website. So let me post the link in here.
And that should be available next week.
Monday the recording will be up.
And I'll get you an updated one that has another slide with the references on it.
So all the presentations in this spring series can be found from this link, and then you can click on each speaker's talk individually to find their presentation and their materials.
And it looks like we may be done with questions. If we are, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have our final presentation in this series next week, and we'll hear a lot more about results from eddy covariance work across the network, and we'll likely get some very insightful and synthetic thoughts from Paul Stoy. We do have one more person typing.
I'm excited about Paul's talk.
Yeah, I think Paul is a great way to kind of cap off the series.
Maybe he has an answer about why we can't close the energy budgets in these covariants.
And let's see, someone was typing, but we may be done now.
All right. Oh.
Oh, just a comment. Thank you. Excellent presentation. I would definitely concur with that. But yeah, thank you very much. A lot of common interest with myself and hopefully with a lot of the audience as well. Different systems, but a lot of the same trends and questions and feedbacks and trade-offs that we see. And I think one thing that I would take from it is that Elaine's comment that the rapidly establishing vegetation is probably per unit area more consuming of water, and I think that would probably help explain a lot of what you're seeing. But great job.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Adrian, and Stephen, thank you.
Sure.
Everybody have a great Friday.
Yes, everyone enjoy their weekend.
Yeah.
We hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.